Okay.
Yes, everybody, thank you so much for coming. And we are very pleased to have with us today Eleanor Winters, and she's going to be doing a write together or using italic swatch capitals. So take it away, Eleanor.
Okay. Thank you, Dorothy. Dorothy, by the way, I love your pink glasses. They are, did you have those before?
No, they're new.
They're new. This is
Yeah,
being
thanks.
recorded.
Yes.
I know we're recording this. Okay. So I'm gonna pin myself or spotlight myself, whatever I'm supposed to do. Anyway, okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last of the Write Together sessions with Dorothy and Symbiosis 2. And I'm very happy to be the end of the story here this year. As Dorothy knows, I'm just opening my ink here as I talk. As Dorothy knows, I was away for the month of September, so I missed a lot of the events. And I hope that if there is a Symbiosis 3, I can be there for more of it. But I did see a lot of your work in the auction catalog, and it's so much beautiful work this year. So I do congratulate everybody. So what we're going to do today, we're calling this Swash Capitals, and it's not exactly a class. I know that the Write Together sessions are a little less formal than a class where everybody makes the same stroke at the same time. But I do want to review a couple of basics. I think it's a good idea, especially for those of you who are perhaps out of practice, haven't been thinking about italic for a long time. Thank you, Kiana. I see something in the chat from Kiana. Yeah, it's great to see all of you again. It's really wonderful. So where was I? Right, I was I was saying, for those of you who may be out of practice or maybe haven't thought about italic in a long time, a lot of you I know are very focused on copperplate, and it's a different alphabet entirely. But the whole school, the whole tradition of broad edge pen calligraphy is remarkable. I'm a big, of course, I'm a big believer in copperplate. I've spent a lot of my adult life being involved with copperplate, but I started with italic, and I never left italic. I've always been involved with italic and with other broad edge pen hands. And one of the things about italic that is wonderful is that it opens the door to using the broad edge pen for a multitude of styles of calligraphy. And when I talk about styles of calligraphy, currently what I'm talking about now is traditional historical calligraphy. And this is something that some of you may have studied. I know Kiana studied with Sheila Waters, I also studied with Sheila Waters. She was one of the remarkable great calligraphers of the 20th century into the 21st century, whom we lost recently. And she inculcated, what's the word? She inspired all of us to look at the models of the past, to consider how a hand was written at the time it was used. And I'm just going to show you something. Now I'm going to switch to my document camera, which you see it's in my way here, but I'm going to switch to it. And here we go. And I just want to show you this beautiful page. This is from a 16th century writing book, a how-to book, a textbook, what you might call a book to learn writing. That was called the Operina. Here it says here, Arrighi's Operina. Operina means the little work, the little oeuvre, right? And Arrighi was the great writing master, one of the great writing masters of the Renaissance. So this was published in 1522. This is actually a translation. It was written in Italian, and in the 1940s, one of the great American calligraphers rewrote it in English, following the letter forms precisely. So it looks very much like the original version. And one of the beautiful pages of this book, it's really a little book. Operina means the little work. One of the beautiful pages has these capital letters. And one thing that I did when I was first learning Italic was I copied this page more than once. And I learning by copying is a wonderful experience. You find that you can do things you didn't know you could do. So this page has some beautiful letters, including, I bring this up especially for what we're doing today, including some swash capitals. Right here, this little form next to the D, this is called the swash, which is a decorative stroke. And if we look at this page, this is not from the Renaissance, this is from me. This is a D without a swash, and here is one with the swash. The difference is the swash capitals are a little bit more decorative. The simple capitals are, as it says, they're simple. Simple, we're not going to do these. Simple as opposed to easy, just simple, meaning that the forms are very, very undecorated, and they're based on Roman capitals that are slanted, the simple capitals. So when I teach Italic, usually in the second level, we do the simple capitals. And as some of you who've studied with me in the past know, the simple capitals are actually a little bit more difficult than these, which are the swash capitals. And the swash capitals have this decorative stroke on some of the letters. So just to go back to Arrighi for a moment, some of the letters on this page show that swash. Here it is on the B, on the F, on the N. These are decorative in various ways. You see, here's a T that has a swash, and this one does not, but it has this amazing descender. And here's a V with a swash, but also swings way up high into the space above, probably 2 or 3 spaces above. So this is a wonderful page to study. And I also brought along a page from another Renaissance master named Palatino. Palatino, also from the 1500s. And this also has some swash capitals mixed in with some very fantastic. This is a really amazing E, quite an interesting. And these pages are such fun. Look at this ampersand. Those of you who like ampersands, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ampersands on this page. This one is astonishing, huh? So they're great fun to work with. But what we're going to do is we're going to consider some of these letters. We're not going to go through every letter on the page, but I'm going to help you with some of the details, okay, and some of the basics. Whoops, I'm losing my Zoom here. Okay, that's better. Okay, hang on just 1 second. Okay, so if there's any problem with the sound or the video, just put something in the chat for me. Something jumped a moment ago and it went off to another page. But anyway, here are the swash capitals. This is my handout. When I'm teaching a beginner class, this is what I give the class. And I'm sure that since this is a write together, you have other examples of swash capitals, or some of you do. Some of you may not. But if you do and you want to work with your own letters, certainly go ahead. I'm not in your presence, so I can't really say, oh no, that's the wrong B, we're not making that B. But watch what I'm doing as well. And if you have experience from another teacher or from a book where you've learned other forms of the swash capitals, then perhaps what I'm going to show you today will give you an alternative So there's no one way to do any alphabet. So here are my guidelines. And what I have here is a page set up for 3mm. And this is a basic italic guideline page where each of these spaces between lines is 5 pen widths. So that means that with a 3mm nib, this is 1.5 centimeters, 15mm between lines. And I have a slant line drawn here. You can see it especially on the edge. Sometimes if you look at the middle of the page, you think, no, that's a vertical, but no, it's slanted. And it's slanted at 7 degrees off the vertical. Now, this is not a required slant any more than my letters are required letters. In fact, to go back to Arrighi for a moment, one of the things that he did was he made vertical capitals. You can see it here with this T, vertical capitals with the slanted minuscule. So these are slightly slanted minuscules. This is a slanted capital, but this T is vertical, this D is vertical. All of these are vertical. So these are perpendicular to the baseline. In fact, when I learned italic a long time ago, back in the 70s, I was taught to do vertical capitals with slanted minuscules. And it took me a long time to even try it a different way. You know, I believed my teacher, which was fine. She was very good. And she said, oh, yes, we're following the Renaissance model, and we're going to make vertical capitals with a slanted minuscule. But I think in contemporary terms, when we're using italic in our normal calligraphy, when I say normal calligraphy, you know, maybe to write an envelope or a certificate, they look a little bit off when you have a letter, a capital this way and a minuscule that way. So I've switched in my own work. I still love these letters, which also happen to be very short compared to the minuscules. If you look at this word do, I'm going to focus in on that just for a moment. Let's look at that for a moment. If you measured that, you would see that the D is maybe 1 pen width above the O. It's very little height above the minuscule. And unlike that one, that T is much taller. But the swash capitals that we're going to do will be a little bit taller than that. We're going to do letters that are about halfway between the waistline and the ascender line. So let's look at that for a moment. And okay, I'm going to take my pen out instead of talking entirely. Hang on. Just taking a bit of paper. I'm going to take a little bit of paper. I always like to start my pen, get it started on a separate piece of paper. And I am going to take another piece of paper and put it under my hand so I don't put my fingers on the writing surface. Let me move my camera back up again. Here we go. And focus. Okay, so here is, let's say here is my baseline. And here is my waistline. So if I were doing excuse me, a minuscule A, that would be the position, right? That would go from line to line, from a waistline to baseline, and excuse me. And if I have an ascender, it's 2 spaces, right? So my L is double the height of my A. I will point out that this form of the minuscule ascender is one version. We also sometimes do an ascender that is simpler. See, this is a simpler form, and as such, I do recommend making it shorter. Now, the capital, however, is going to be somewhere around here. And I actually I'm pretty sure that when I learned it, so we're going back a long way now, I was told that it was 7.5 pen widths. Now, if this is 5 pen widths, and this is 5 pen widths, so 7.5 would be here. So 7.5 pen widths. And when I mentioned that because I tend to make it just a little bit shorter. So I'll go a little bit shorter than that, and I'll bring it in about here. And what I'm going to do, just for the basis, for the sake of demonstrating, I'm going to draw a line. And sometimes, now you might want to do this too, sometimes when you are practicing your capitals, it's helpful to make a line for the top of the capital. When you're writing a word, you tend to eyeball it, meaning you just estimate the height. I actually made this line a little too low. I'm going to just redo that. Okay, we're going to ignore the lower line. And here is our basic downstroke, 45 degrees, right? We're staying with our 45-degree pen angle, which is, of course, you're all familiar with this. That's this, it's half of a square, right? That's our pen angle, 45 degrees, and we're going to make a downstroke. So that's a downstroke, and it's going to follow the slant. And for the basic downstroke for capitals, we tend to do this. We tend to pull it a little to the left and then give it a base. And at the end of the base, usually a little upstroke like that. Nothing too radical, nothing too angular, nothing too wiggly, just a downstroke and a stroke across and a little finish. And that's our basic downstroke. And if you look at the I, you see it over here. And if you look at the F, you see it here, and the P and the R. It's the end of a downstroke. It gives it a finish. And just to point out, on the simple caps, we tend to leave that out and just give it a little curve, tiny curve at the bottom. So the I in the simple caps is as simple as it can be without having nothing, right? The simplest perhaps is this, but with the simple capitals, we start and end with a little stroke. But with the swash capitals, we give it a bit more, I would almost say decorative, a slightly decorative finish. The other part of the capitals, I think of the capitals as having two basic parts. One is the downstroke with some kind of ending. Sometimes we make that ending longer. And some letters, we're going to extend that, as you'll see, or even longer than that. So on the E, for example, that ending is going to extend like this, but it's the same movement. It's a little to the left at the bottom, just a little pull to the left, and then straight across the baseline and a bit of an upstroke over here. And on the P, R, I, it's very small. On the D and the E, it's going to be longer. So this would be the P, the R, the I, this would be the E and the D. Okay, and this one, or a little bit longer than that, we're going to use for the B. But let's look at the swash. And the swash itself, now once again, I'm going to add in my line here, see if I can draw it a little bit, just a little better than I did last time. Okay, I'm working with guidelines under my page, which are here. You know, what I did was I taped my white paper to the guidelines. But I penciled in these lines to make it a little more visible for you. I can see my lines, but I think on the screen, the lines underneath my white paper are a little more faint. So again, here's my downstroke. With a little finish. And here is the swash. And the swash looks like this. It's a stroke going down, followed by, I'm going to say plus, a stroke that goes up and across like that. So that can be done in 2 separate strokes or in one. So in 2 separate strokes, we pull a little from the right and we come down, and then we pull up here and we go across, which creates this kind of thin point where the downstroke and the cross stroke are meeting at a thin point. So I'll do that again, down and up and across. Or, and this is something that, just dipping into my ink again, you can also continue without lifting your pen by reversing direction, going back up, and then coming over to the right and across. So this one is done in 2 strokes, 1 and 2, and this one is done in 1 stroke, like that. I find, here's a little hint, I find that with a larger nib, I'm more likely to use 2 strokes. With a small nib, now this is I consider the 3mm a large nib. So with a 2 or even more likely a 1, I'm going to do that with a little more, little faster maybe, where I go down and up and over without lifting my pen. And I would also like to point out that I keep this downstroke parallel to the slant lines. And the reason is that here's the letter T, for example. Having the swash and the downstroke parallel is a nice feature of the alphabet. There's a certain stability to it. And if I did something like this, where I curved it, it changes it. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing to do, but traditionally, the downstroke of the swash follows the slant, or in the case of the vertical letters that they did in the Renaissance, it would also go straight the way the downstroke would go straight. So this kind of curve, we use that sometimes. It's kind of a little more playful, a little bit bouncier, but it's a bit less traditional. So you're on your own about that. You can make your own decision. Now here are a couple of things I want to point out about this. One is, now this is something that so many people have a problem with. Here's our downstroke. If you start the swash at the same height as the downstroke, so I'll darken that. Here's our line. So I started that right at the line. If I start the swash here at the same height, look at what's going to happen. I'm going to go above the downstroke. And what I want to do is cross that downstroke to make a solid connection. So to do that, I'm going to do this. Oops, let me move over here a little bit. I'm going to start it lower. So notice the relationship between the beginning of my swash here and the beginning of my downstroke. I'm starting it lower so that, let me show you this here. This is one of those fine tuning things that can really make your letters a bit better. So I'm starting it lower, so that when I make the cross stroke, it'll come in here, the stroke across, you see? And it'll cross over that thin point at the top. And that'll avoid this kind of broken effect. And one more thing about the swash. See, I'm talking about the swash and we have only done one letter. So let's see, I'll see if I can do a few letters for you today besides the T. So one other thing that also comes up in classes, students ask me why I'm starting with a downstroke, why I'm doing this as a downstroke. I'm going to ask you to hang on one sec. I just want to get a pencil that's a little darker. Okay, don't go away. Thank you. See, I just got a blacker pencil so you can see my lines a little bit better. Okay, so the other question which does come up sometimes is why we start with a downstroke. And this is something those of you who have a reasonable amount of experience with a broad edge pen know the answer to. And the answer is that moving the pen from top to bottom is much easier, or when I say easier, the ink flows better going down than it does going up. So let me get some ink on my pen here. So if I'm starting like, whoops, I say it's easier. If I'm starting like that, it's easier for me to make a clean stroke than if I do that, which of course worked this time. Okay, here's one that didn't work. I purposely made that not work. In order to make an upstroke work, I have to press really hard. I can make a downstroke work with a very light pressure. So I always, whenever possible, when a stroke begins, I go from top to bottom or left to right rather than right to left. And that, if you recall, when we do this, this top of the minuscules, I always start this way rather than that way, because that way sometimes the ink doesn't flow. So there's our swash. That's probably more than you ever wanted to know about the swash. And we can use that downstroke. Now again, notice I'm starting lower than the top of this letter. I can come across and around like that and stop and make an extra stroke going from left to right and up, left to right and up to make the P. Okay, and this starts exactly like the T. Or the R is going, see, I'm coming down, I'm coming across, and here my stroke is a little more diagonal than on the P. And then here I'm going to make a little curve and come out and up. So that ending of the R looks like that. Okay, and always consider or practice like this, not just consider, but when you're practicing, let's say you're doing let's do a P again. I'm going to give you two things to consider. One is leaving plenty of space here. It's much better with a little too much space. This is a little too much. I think this is better than not enough. So if you did the P and you started the swash here, what happens is the balance of space is wrong. So this is, I'm going to say no, this is too close. So we want to leave either equal space or even more than equal space between the swash and the downstroke. Same thing on the T. You want to leave enough space on the T here so that this white space here and this white space here have pretty much the same quantity. Okay, and then the other thing I want you to do when you're practicing these letters, the P, the R, the T is, I'll do it over here. See, nice big space. Do an R. Is do a minuscule with an ascender near it. So let's say I'm going to write Robert. I would do this and this just to reinforce for yourself the fact that the capital is much shorter than the ascender. Okay, so it's good to write words and to come up with names. Doesn't have to be a name. It can just be just a word starting with a capital, and use a letter with an ascender either right next to it or a letter or two apart. So with P, you could do PH, Philip, or you could write PL, please, and see that relationship. Okay, so further, we can extend our baseline stroke like that. I mentioned that we make an E with an extended stroke. And then what I do here, and here's something else to point out. When I make the top stroke of the E, I would like to try to keep it lined up with the bottom. So I want it to be about the same length on the top that the stroke is on the bottom, and the middle stroke is equal like that. And that gives you a nicely balanced letter. So I'm going to do one wrong here also. This is something that I think a lot of people do. I'm going to say, I would say wrong. Okay, we'll call it wrong. Or we could say it's a bad choice, which is this, right? And I think there are a lot of typefaces that we base our calligraphy on. So maybe you see an E like that in a typeface, which is, a kind of quirky form. But in italic, these three strokes end equally. Okay, and if you're making an F, which I could have done before the E, if you're making an F, we're going to make this same stroke at the top that we have on the E, and the center stroke is the same. Again, it's the same length or the same width, I should say, as the top of the F. So that too is not going to be this little truncated form, right? So that's important. Another thing that's important, and this is kind of a funny way to put it, but another thing that's important is to kind of ignore the waistline. Here's our waistline, because on the E and the F, we want the middle stroke, in fact, to be in the middle between the top and the baseline, not at the waistline. And which would mean, of course, that when you make an F or an E, but I'll do an F for now. If you make an F and you have an I, let's say right here, the top of the I is actually above the middle stroke of the F. It's not, the F is not up here at the line. And I think what happens sometimes is we're so conscious of our lines that we do something like this. And you're going to see, of course, right away why this is not so good. Oops, I need some ink. This obviously, right? You can see why that's terrible. What I did was I followed my guideline for the waistline. Right, no. and I made the cross stroke too big. So we have to be aware of our white space. This is something that is a given in any calligraphy that you do, any calligraphy, whether it's even, I hate to use the expression, but even modern calligraphy, which some of you know is something that I mostly avoid. But in Gothic, in uncial, in copperplate, in flourishing, the white space is critical. We have to be aware of the negative space, the white space, or it's also called the negative space. Okay, so we have one more letter or two more letters in this group. We also have the B. And the B is, oh, and the D. So the bottom of the B is a little shorter, not as wide as the E. And then we're going to do something like the R. We're going to come in as if we're making an R, but then we're going to come back out and around and meet the bottom at the thin point. So notice that the base of the B came up a little bit so that I have a kind of a point to aim for when I make my second curve here, my second big curve. Okay, and I would say if we want to be absolutely mathematically strict, I would say the width at the bottom is just the tiniest bit beyond the width at the top. You want to be careful that you don't do, I'll just draw this with a pen, with a pencil. You want to be careful that you don't do that. You don't want the bottom to extend beyond the top. Okay, and like the B and like the E, here's a cross between the B and the E. We're going to come down here and extend this like an E. So it's a little longer than the B. And we're going to do a single big curve here to make a D. And I'm sure some of you have heard this from me before. I'm sure Leslie and Kiana remember I've said this 100 times or more. To make a good curve, watch the inside of the curve. Don't look at the black line. Look at the white space to the left of the black line. Or if you're making a curve on this side, you know, like the O, you want to watch the white space to the right of the black line. So you want to watch the space that you are enclosing. And that will help you make a nice, smooth and beautiful curve. It's very easy to make a terrible curve, I will tell you that. And if I'm not paying attention, I can make a pretty bad curve myself. Okay, so one more on this series, and that is the letter I, which should be the easiest. We looked at this before, this downstroke, and that downstroke is most of the letter I. But in fact, we're going to start that with a little stroke at the top, and that stroke is just like this, just a stroke from left to right. But we're going to take that stroke and pull it back a little bit as we make the downstroke. So it's got a little swing back, very subtle, that looks like this. And then, of course, we're doing the same thing on the bottom. So what happens on the letter I is we do this and down and then that. So it's really the same top and bottom. And just to add something to this, I will sometimes do an I that has a stroke like this. I'm just adding this in as a little extra, as a stroke like this, and then down with a little more space. Let's open that up a little bit. This is not really a standard swash capital, but sometimes we need something with a little more pizzazz, maybe a little more oomph than, there, that's better, than this, this simple top. So if you look at, see, I'm coming down first like that, and then this way, and sometimes it's a nice relationship. Okay, so we have other letters in our group which have the swash, and there's a series of letters that start with the swash. Now, each of these have the swash as part of the second stroke. See, we have our downstroke, then swash into the second or the second and then third stroke. But we can also start with a swash like that. And from there, we can do the same thing that I did over here, which is come back in and down like this. I'm going to pull to the left and down, and then before I get to the baseline, I'm going to take my stroke and move it to the left like that. Now, I didn't curve it up. It gives you the impression somehow of, there's a feeling here that it's going to continue like this, but it doesn't. This stays really flat on the line. So let's look at that again. This can all be done in a kind of single fluid movement. So I'm at this point, I don't have to stop. I just pull back and down and push. You have to press a little bit over here to get the ink flowing well. And from that stroke, we can make actually quite a few letters. So we can, if you look here, let's look at our model here. Let me move that for a moment. And here it is on the H, on the K, on the M, on the N, the U,
the W,
the V and W as well. Although on, and the A, yeah. So, but there is a difference. There's a subtle difference among these letters, because on the H, the downstroke of the H and the downstroke of the K follow the slant. On the A, it comes out to the left. On the M, it comes out to the left. On the V, it goes a little bit to the right. So there are some differences in direction. So there are several possibilities based on that stroke. So for actually the H, the K, and the N, this stroke is coming parallel to the slant line. For the A and the M, oops, it's coming out to the left. So that's the A and the M. And for the V and the W, oops, I went a little bit uphill here, so just forgive me for that. It's coming just a little bit to, oops, V and W, a little bit to the right, but the movement is all the same. It starts with a swash, and then it either goes this way or that way or that way. So there are several directions, but all of these strokes begin with a swash, where all of the ones I showed you before have the swash as part of a second stroke of the letter. Okay, so there's also another thing that's very subtle that I want to point out, and then I'll make a couple of these letters for you. On the H and the K and the N, there's also the U. I'm going to talk about the U in a moment. I have this little, what I think of as a pullback, this little movement here, this thing here that I do on the eye, where this swash goes across and then comes back a little bit to the left. On the V, it does the same thing. It pulls back. On the A and the M, we don't need to do that because the stroke itself is going to the left. So you see when I'm doing this little movement this way, it's going left, but I don't need to do it again on the A and the M. It not only is it not necessary, but it won't even particularly show. So let me. So I wouldn't do that and then down. All I need to do is pull my pen to the left, and it has that same base over here that I have on the H and the K, and then I have my second stroke of my A. So the top, having that extra little movement here doesn't add anything. In fact, it can make it a little bit messier at the top. It gets a little bit muddled. And then remember, perhaps you remember that on the A, when we make our horizontal stroke here, it's in the visual center of the letter, which is a little bit below the measurable center. So here's our space. This would be about the middle here. And notice that my cross stroke is a little bit lower. Okay, I am going to take another piece of paper so I can continue. Hang on, I'm untaping this. And then we'll look at this group of letters again. Now, why am I taping my paper? Obviously, I'm taping it so it won't move around, but I will mention that this paper that I'm using is called Tomoe River. I'll write this down. I actually heard about this for the first time from someone in Hong Kong. And so I think it's Japanese. I think it's a Japanese paper. I get it in a package from Amazon in the US, and it's quite thin. So I tape it because it's so thin that it moves. If I just, if I move my hand, the paper goes somewhere, moves away. But it's wonderful for two reasons. Number one, I can see the lines so well through it. And number two, the quality of the line that I make is very clean. And I'm just going to draw in a line here, which means that I make a very sharp-edged line, which I like very much. I'm going to put in my my top again here. Okay, so here, let's go back to this downstroke. So the first downstroke we did started like that, right? And this one is quite different. It starts with a swash. See, I'm starting a bit lower and I'm going to come across. I'm going to pull back and come straight. When I say straight, I mean parallel to my slant line. And then the right side of my H I'm going to give it enough space so it's not too crowded. It's going to start like the I, so that little stroke across, pull back a little bit. And here at the bottom, I'm going to end it like a minuscule letter. And I'm going to make my connection over here. And looking at this, I'm going to say that I could actually I'm going to add a millimeter or two to the width. There we go. So slightly wider, I think, is better. So I'm going to say this is a bit too narrow, and this is better. Okay, and the K, when we make the K, I'm going to do something which you might find interesting. I'm going to compare the K to the H. So if I made an H, I'll do this in pencil, right? here's my downstroke. The K, this part of the top of the K is going to start a little bit closer than the H. And I'm going to aim for the center. I'm going to start here. So I'm going to start it here like that. So I'm moving, oh, not even a pen, maybe a pen width closer to my downstroke. And I'm going to make that little curve and diagonal like that, the way I do on the R. Okay, so you can see that the bottom of the K is the same width as the H, but the top is just a bit narrower. And the reason for that, let's just do one. I'll do one wrong. It gets a little too thin up here and a little too open if I start farther away. So you have to move that stroke in a little bit to make it work. So the K and the H both start with the same downstroke, and the A, as I said before, takes that downstroke and swings it a little bit to the left, as does the M. The ink that I'm using at the moment is Pelikan Fount India. And it's a nice black. It's not as rich as a Sumi ink, but it has a nice thin line. It has a nice flow and a nice thin line. So I'm going to say that I want to make this a little longer for the M. And why is that? I'm going to extend that a bit, and for good reason. And the reason is I want a little more space in here because of the diagonal. If you make the top of the M the same length, the swash, as the K or the H, the diagonal closes that space. So I have just extended that a little bit. I would say in the H and the K, the down part and the cross part of the swash are about equal. On the M, it's a little bit longer at the top. And then I'm going to make a stroke here that is only slightly slanted to the right. This space is now a little smaller than the A. Now there are two possibilities here. You can push right up and come down again. So you could do your M where it's all the second stroke finishes the letter, or you can do two additional strokes. Now, how would I make that decision? I did this in 4 strokes. So this is 1, this is 2, all downstrokes, not counting the swash. So that's actually an extra stroke. My choice, it's just like what I said before about doing the swash in 1 stroke, where you go, down and up and over. If I wanted to go down, up, I would probably do that when I'm writing a little bit smaller. It flows better with a number 2, let's say a 2mm nib. I can do it with the 3. I'm gonna do this just to demonstrate. Oops, let me move. I'm gonna move down a line because that's smeared a little bit. Okay. So I can do this. But I'm going to say it works okay because my paper is really smooth. If your paper has a little bit of tooth, a little bit of texture, you're going to do better making 4 downstrokes. So be patient, give yourself that extra time to make extra strokes. And either way, if I'm doing a letter that's this size, and assume that's a broad edge pen, then doing this is quite comfortable. So I'm doing this as this plus this. but with a large nib, I'm more likely to use 4 strokes. Okay, so we have a couple more letters that start with the swash and, oh, the V and the W, of course. So with the V and the W, and then I'll go back to the N and the U. With the V and the W, we're going to change direction, and I'm going just a little bit to the right. I don't want to go too wide or my letter will be too wide. So I'm going to pull in a little bit here and come down here. And then I'll make a second downstroke that starts with what I call a little hook like that. And I'm aiming for that point. I'm looking at that point so that I can meet it with a nice clean connection. Okay, with the minuscule again, you know, I'll do this with ink. With the minuscule, we push right up, right? We do it in one go. But with the capital, it makes more sense in terms of pen control to make that as a downstroke. And the W is similar, but when I make my second downstroke, I'm making this space a little smaller. And then I do this. So the center of the W relates a little bit to the minuscule W, where if you recall, we have right here, we have a little curve in. So let's look at that again. W is a little bit more difficult letter. So we come in this way, and then our next stroke is just a stroke down, and here I'm coming like that, starting with a little pull to the right, which gives it a nice point at the top. Okay, this is a little more difficult. And I hesitated there before I made my second stroke because for some reason on the W, I am more inclined to do all of this, to do that as an upstroke. I'm not sure if this is better or worse. So this is a downstroke, but I stop here and I add this as a downstroke. So let's look at that one more time. I'm going to put in my top line again because I see my letters are really varying in size and I'd like them to stay a little more consistent. So here's my top line and my baseline. So let's just look at the W again. There's my swash. Gonna pull to the left and down, and then I'll push up. And at this point, I'm going to do this. I'm going to pull in like that. Now, when I make the second downstroke, my eye is on the first downstroke because I want the second one parallel to the first one. And I want the right side, the last stroke, parallel to this upstroke. Like that. So like the M, I'm looking at the relationship between the two white spaces here, the two white spaces there. Very important. So to get those white spaces equal, those triangles, triangle, triangle, I want 2 parallel thin lines and 2 parallel thick lines. Same thing here, 2 parallel thick lines and 2 parallel thin lines. I think I'm just going to do a couple more. I know that we can run over time, but I think I'll just, what I'm going to do, I'm looking at my page here. Since we're calling this swash capitals, what I'm going to do is demonstrate for you the other letters with swashes, which are the U and the N, and the rest don't have a swash. So I can talk about those briefly, but I don't really need to teach it to you in terms of the swash, especially since you probably signed on for an hour and you don't want this to be too long. So when we make a U, we're going to start the same way, like that. And the downstroke is going to be like the H. Now, here's the downstroke of the H. The U, instead of pushing to the left, is going to curve to the right. And the bottom of the U is going to be similar to the minuscule U. Now, I'm going to put in a minuscule U here. What happens when we make the minuscule U? We have a curve going up, which is thin over here and gets thicker over here. So here's the minuscule U. And similarly, the capital U is going to come down and swing over. Now, what did I do here? What I did was I made that curve a little wider than this one. Look at the white space here and the white space there, a little wider and therefore a little bit heavier on the bottom, a little bit heavier. And I'm stopping about 2/3 of the way up, and I'm going to put my pen right here. I'll just draw this and then I'm going to make my downstroke as a separate stroke over here. So let's look at that again. This is not a difficult letter, but it's important to be aware of what's happening at the bottom, which is this kind of big swing to the right, and then how this stroke comes down and up. Okay, you'll also see some U's. Let me find my Arrighi page again. There is Arrighi. Oh, this is, in fact, kind of an exaggeration, but sometimes the U has, this is very much an exaggeration, has a big rounder base. And you'll see that in italic, not quite as wide, but rounder. Let me look at the Palatino for a moment. Yep, he did that too. Palatino also makes this rounder base, but these letters are all kind of, you know, they're sort of all over the place. So, okay, so that's the U. And the other one that I wanted to show you is the N. And that is we're going right back to our H. We're going to start it exactly the same as the H. And come across and down. I have a little too much ink on my nib here, but there's the first stroke of my H. And the N, the second stroke is going to be the cross stroke. And something happens when you make the cross stroke, which is right here. We're going to curve in a little bit before we make a diagonal. And that little curve in, let's draw this. That curve in is going to overlap the stroke that's here like that. And then right at the bottom here, I'm just going to pull the line a little bit into the left, very little. So that center stroke looks like this. It just points to the baseline as opposed to this. It's not a big curve to the right. Okay, so let's let me put in my line again and we'll look at that as one letter. For some reason, which I do understand, for some reason, the N is the hardest capital. You know, I mean, it's possible, the O is hard too, because of course it has to be perfect, but the N, it's this stroke that kind of gets people. And I think if you think of it as a bigger curve at the top that's overlapping the swash and a tight little one at the bottom, you shouldn't have too much problems, or at least that'll get you started. So let's look at that. So I'm going to pull back. So just like the H, just like that, I'm going to overlap this stroke, overlap, come across and push down a little bit. And then over here, I'm going to aim for this point. That's my goal. I want to reach that goal. So I'm going to make a little hook and come down like that. And I'm now going to make the same letter a little better because it's a little too narrow. So I want to make that a bit wider. There we go. I've made that wider, and here is that stroke. And there you go. There is your N. This takes some practice. So what I'd like to do is just talk very briefly about what else is on this page, which I think Dorothy posted. So you all have I think you could print out a copy of it. Is that possible? Is that true, Dorothy? Yes, good. Okay,
Yes.
so just to remind you, if you've studied these before, the C, the G, the O, the Q all start with the same big curve. And the right side of the O should be the same as the left side of the O. So if you turn your paper over, it should be about the same, pretty close, and the same with the Q. So those four letters are not swash capitals. In fact, if you look at the simple capitals, they're basically the same letters. OC, C, G, O, Q, same as the swash. The difference actually, as some of you might recall, is the simple capitals are made with a different pen angle. These are 45 degrees and the simple capitals are 30 degrees. So that's a group. The J starts like the I, and then you come down to this point and make a second stroke, curving around. The L also is a letter that is very similar, whether it's a simple capital or a swash capital. There's no place for a swash on the L. We want to make a nice double curve here. So curve at the beginning, straight curve at the end, just like the Q. The Q is a bit more dramatic. And the Z, they all have the same stroke at the bottom. Notice that the Z is straight at the top, straight diagonal, and then it swings at the bottom. Okay, the X is like the minuscule X, only bigger and a bit wider. The S is also similar to the minuscule, except two things. First of all, we start with the center, then we do the bottom, then we do the top, and it's a little bit rounder, a little wider and rounder than the minuscule, but it's a similar form. I'm just going to compare those two for you so you see what I'm talking about. So the minuscule S starts with the top and then center and then bottom, straight, straight. And the capital has a little more curve at the beginning and end, a wider center, and then a little bit of a curve here around and up, and then a similar stroke on the top. So they're related, but not identical, just as the U is related to the capital U, but not identical. Okay, and finally, we have a Y, which is based on the V and the I. And the thing to be aware of here is that the V part of the Y is a little more than half of the letter. So I'll do that one and then I will definitely stop. So, so if this is here's our midpoint here. When I do the V, I'm going to bring my V part, the Y, I'm going to bring my V down a bit like that. And then what happens is the white space in the Y is the midpoint. The black part of the V part of the Y is lower. You see the black part is lower, but the white part is at the center. And you might notice, here's something that I'll just point out. You might notice that I changed my pen angle a little bit here. I flattened my pen for the second stroke of the V. So there you go. That is a very quick and brief discussion, demonstration of the capitals. I'm going to change back to the
Eleanor,
other
there's a
camera.
question.
Yes, of course.
Tiana is asking why are simple capitals at 30 degrees and swash at 45 degrees? Is there a reason behind this?
That's a good question. And, I can only guess. And I would guess that the simple capitals are, they're shorter and they have a certain stability in the space. So they're a little bit more, heavy and solid. So for example, you would have, let's look at this. That's a great question, Kiana. I mean, I would have to ask, Mr. Origi, who isn't around to answer my question. But if we look at the H like that, there's the 45 degree H, and here's a shorter H at a flatter pen angle, right? It has a very different feeling. So this one has a little bit more swing and this one is a little more solid. So it's an alternate alphabet, and using the simple capital. So here's a 45 degree capital O. And here's a 30 degree capital O. They look similar, but this should perhaps be even a little bit shorter. It has a different relationship to the minuscule. So it gives you a choice. You can write a lighter weight, kind of bouncier alphabet. I tend to use the simple capitals with that simpler form of the ascender. So if I'm doing, let's say I'm writing a swash A, and I'm writing Alice. I'm going to do this. Right. Let me just get some ink. Right. And if I'm using the swash letter, the simple letter, very different. It's a completely different alphabet. I'm more likely to do this with a 45 degree pen angle, but a little bit a rather different effect, you see. This one has that. This almost feels as if I'm about to flourish the letter, which I can't do here. Okay, is that helpful, Kiana? Yes?
Yes, it's very clear. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Are there other questions? Anyone want to jump in with a question? Or are you all overwhelmed? So I'm gonna come back and go to the gallery view so I can see everybody, and really do join in if you have something you'd like to say. And yes, no. Was this helpful? You could say yes, it was helpful. Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Leslie. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. And, I don't know if you had enough time to write, because this was supposed to be right together and I was doing all the talking and most of the writing. Okay, Dorothy did a lot of writing. Good. Okay. And so did Leslie. Oh, nice work, Leslie. Okay, good. Thank you. Oh, thank you all for holding up your work. That looks great. Okay.
Sorry,
Yep.
I removed the spotlight. Yeah, so everybody, I'm gonna stop the recording now. So thank you for joining, and you can catch up with the demo on the, you can watch the playback on the YouTube channel because it will be uploaded.